Our next speaker is from McDonald Marketing, Libby Spears, changing demographics and how they affect your business. Equal parts educator, liberator, and entertainer. We'll judge the entertainer part. Libby believes in the power of creative communication strategies that will catapult your business success. Former college professor, she's a storyteller and shares her insights and wisdom to motivated professionals who want to become more successful. She started Bravo Communications and Consulting in 2006. In 2011, she published the book, What's Your Plan B? To help people figure out and to achieve their heart's desire. Libby also established a scholarship fund benefiting the Denton Public School Foundation. She is here in conjunction with McDonald Marketing, a nationally recognized marketing firm with a deep specialization in multicultural and diversity marketing. The firm has worked with APRO and various other rental companies for several years, and she really knows the rent-to-own business. The firm's founder, Kelly McDonald, is the author of the best-selling book, How to Market to People Not Like You. The firm has twice been named one of the top advertising agencies in the U.S. by Advertising Age magazine. Please welcome Libby Spears.
Turned on here. Are we good? Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? There is a phenomenon called the post-lunch dip. It is where what you had for lunch combined with your own body's natural physiological tendencies, you tend to feel tired, perhaps lethargic. The word siesta may come into mind, and you may be thinking, oh, if only I could take a power nap. But I am here to rescue you if you are feeling that dip with information on the 2010 census. Is there anything more sexy or provocative than talking about the census? One of the most elaborate, detailed undertakings that our government has been doing since the 1700s to account for what is happening in our country right here and right now. Now, if you came in from lunch and you noticed at the table, there is a handout for those of you who are A++ students and you like to take notes. You can follow along with me that way. I also have slides. As a former professor, I promise you that there will be no test, Scantron, or number 2 pencil at the end of today's presentation. What I want to do for you is to illuminate what came out of that census and how it impacts you in your businesses, your organizations, and as professionals. So I'm going to attempt, if it didn't make your summer reading list, the 2010 census, right? 50 Shades of Grey, 2010, okay. If it didn't make your summer reading list, my job today is to try to pull out for you what I think will be incredibly informative to help you go back to your businesses and make really great decisions moving forward in terms of who are you reaching out to and how are you reaching out to them. So we're going to begin by looking at some of the implications that came out of that census, some of the big key findings, and I'll give you a nice broad overview of some of the big categories of findings that I think impact us all as professionals. First off, we'll do a classroom question. How often is the census done? Thank you, every 10 years. And why does it matter? Typically, when the census is published and we know its findings, what sorts of things are done with that census? Why is it important? Okay, so it helps to determine the numbers of dollars that are distributed from a federal down to our state and local communities in terms of dollars that we get. What else does it impact? Our representation in our government and the voice that we have in our government. So I'm from Texas. We have the second largest population in the United States, next to California. And the census is incredibly important to us because it impacts our representation as well as the number of dollars that we get. How else is it important, though, beyond some of those very typical and standard types of applications that we're familiar with? How many of you retailers and business owners downloaded your copy instantly when it was published? Anybody? Has anybody read it? Anybody read that or the healthcare law that's going to get, it's sort of cumbersome, and there's a lot there to deal with. But I'm here to tell you that it also can impact you as professionals and how you do business. It costs for every person in the census that is measured, the cost per person is $50 a person. That is incredibly costly. And it's a government program, so that makes sense, right? But it is a really costly program. So knowing that, it isn't free. You're paying for it one way or the other, so why not use it to your benefit? And that's where I come into the picture. That's my goal today, is to help you understand how it impacts you. So let's look at some of the key findings we're going to discuss this afternoon. First, we're going to talk about what our country looks like in terms of diversity right here and right now. We're also going to consider this cultural generation gap that we are experiencing in the United States. We're going to look at these shifts that are happening in our nation from rural to urban and what that means and the implications that it has for us as professionals and as business owners. We're going to talk about a phenomenon being referred to as bright flight. We'll come to that in a moment. I'll tell you what it means. We're also going to consider another phenomenon that the 2010 census revealed, and that is that for the first time ever, we have more minorities who are moving to the suburbs and out of urban city centers. And then we're going to talk about what we know about marriage and family in the United States right here and right now today. So I'm going to go through each one of those. I'm going to tell you some things that I think are interesting and important, and we're going to circle back around and talk about how this impacts you in the marketplace and how knowing what you know about the 20 census, does it allow you to position yourself in a way that you can reach out to those demographics successfully. So we'll talk about the implications that the census has on us from a business perspective. We're going to touch on some of the marketing implications in terms of how we tell our story as businesses and who we talk about, who we are, and how do we create messaging that gets in front of some of these key demographics that we're going to identify. And then we're going to look at it from a different organizational perspective. We're not going to just talk today about how it impacts you from a perspective in a selling position to clients and customers, but also how it impacts you as an organization in terms of hiring, recruiting talent, managing talent, and keeping talent. So we'll look at it from a number of different perspectives. I have to say that this conference, the lineup of speakers, and the wonderful connection between topics is something that I'm sure many of you have noticed already. The speaker this morning was fantastic. I was floored when I found out he was 12 years old. It's like, man, you got an early start. But what he talked about was phenomenally important. In fact, it's a really popular topic across a number of industries. And I hope today what I'm going to tell you about is going to complement what he said, that we're going to look at it from a couple of different perspectives, and that you'll leave the room today feeling so much smarter and so much better equipped to go back and be productive and successful and effective. So let's start by talking about diversity. Now, I'm going to move off the stage because I get a little sad and bored up here. So I'm going to move off the stage and I'm going to come out there and spend a little bit of time with you while we talk about diversity and what the 2010 census tells us about diversity. Okay, so there is a standard that is used when we look at diversity in our nation today, and it's called the Census Diversity Index. And it's a very simple construct, and essentially what it says is how likely are you to take two random people and then be of a different race? So how likely are you to take two random people and they would be of a different race? And you can see here that this has been changing dramatically over the last few decades. So in 1980, you had a 34% chance that if you grabbed two people off the street, they would be of a different race. And as you follow along and you look at what was happening in the 90s, into the 2000s, and today, that number has gone up substantially. In fact, today, you are more likely than 2% to grab two people off the street and they would be of a different race. So just from a diversity perspective, this is changing and this is becoming more of an issue in terms of how we message and how we storytell and how we talk to people. So that begins to skim the surface. But let's get even a little more specific. When we look at it on a state-by-state level, we see that this is becoming even more of a phenomenon. So today, with regard to states that have what is referred to as a minority-majority population, we have 5 states in the United States today that have a minority-majority population. And those states are Texas. Raise your hand. Texas? People in the house? Thank you. California. Any Californians? It's hard to see hands being raised. No one, did y'all not invite California? Were they not invited? Okay. New Mexico? Anybody from New Mexico? Hawaii? And then the District of Columbia. So those 5 spots in the United States right now, so it's not 10 years away, it's not 15 years away, it's right here and right now. But it gets even more interesting when we look what happened in the census in 2010. When you look at minority-majority populations among children, okay, so just among children, 18 years of age and under, we begin to see that this is even more present in a number of our states. So it is up 5 states from the year 2000 where there is a majority-minority population among children, meaning that there are more children who are a minority in these states. And some of them, as you look up at the screen, you'll see that there's some usual suspects. You would expect that some of these would have large populations of minority children. Southern states, for example. But one that sticks out that is unusual and for the first time ever is Nevada. Anybody from Nevada? So what our census reveals to us is that what over the last 20 years appeared to be more of an issue along those southern states that bordered Mexico, it is now becoming something that we're experiencing across the United States. Moving forward then, let's talk a little bit about non-Hispanic whites, what the census told us. So the white share of the total U.S. population dropped over the last decade by 5%. And that may not seem like a lot, but when we dig a little bit deeper, we see that it has some implications. Because where it becomes interesting is when we not only look at those people in the population who are white, but we factor in their age. And what we find is that our white population in the United States is aging quickly. In fact, today, after the 2010 census came out, the average age of a white person in the United States today is 41 years old. And that is up from 38.6 in the 2000 census. So our white population is aging. We have a number of states who have a majority-minority of children in their states. And then when we began to look at it in more depth, we see some other interesting things. The census projects into the future. They're like fortune tellers. They pull out their ball, right, and they say, okay, so based on what we know, what projections can we say with regard to where our country is heading in light of these numbers? And what they said in the 2010 census is that by 2041, non-Hispanic whites will be the minority in the United States. Now, if you look in the parentheses, that's actually a lot quicker than what they estimated in the year 2000. In the year 2000, they said it was going to be in 2056. Now, I'm not going to do the math for some of you, but I can look around and see some of us intend to be here in 2041, right? We're doing the math, we're getting out the calculator, you're like, yeah, I'm going to be here in 2041. I suspect that if the 2010 census upped the year prediction from the 2000 census, that by the time we get to 2020, we're going to see that that number is also going to be pushed up as well. Does that make sense? So don't plan for 2041, plan for right now. Start addressing these issues right now. It's not one of those things where you think it's never going to come like a kid waiting for Christmas. The census doesn't always get it right in terms of their projections. And in fact, there are a number of conditions that could be put into place every day that could bump that number up a lot quicker than 2041. Okay, so we're going to move forward. Another thing with regard to what we know about diversity doesn't only relate to race and issues of race. Some other things that we know that came out of the census that probably won't surprise anyone is that there's more women in the country right now than there are men. Except in like maybe Alaska, because I remember there was always like 10 Alaskan men for every Alaskan woman or something. But overall, there are more women in the United States today than there are men. And we live longer. So our longevity is better. We may not live better because our longevity may not necessarily mean quality of life, but we do live longer. How many of you knew these two things? Right? How many of you were like, duh, I knew that. But here's where I think it gets more interesting. Not only are there more women in the United States today, but there are more women in the college classroom today. And that is unprecedented. So we have more women in the college classroom. We have more degrees being awarded to women. We have more women who are in graduate programs. And for the first time ever, we have more women who are in law school. Now hold on to that because we're going to circle back around to it. You're thinking if I were a freshman again, right? You're like, that would have been great. Yeah. You're like, all right, more. I know, because I read minds. That's my side gig. If this doesn't work out, I read minds. So hold on to some of that and let it marinate. Now here's what I want you to do as I go through each one of these categories. I want you to be thinking about your own implications, because I'm going to ask you later on for you to provide us with some of your own ideas about how this impacts the way that you do business. So this is going to be like a give and take. I'm going to give you a couple, you're going to give me one, because we want some best practices to come out of this room today. You're here to learn not just from the speakers, but from one another. So as we go through these categories, be thinking about, okay, so what does that mean for the way that I'm doing business right now? The second category that is noteworthy for us is what is referred to as a cultural generation gap. So your morning speaker did a beautiful, phenomenal job talking about the differences between generations. I actually had to get a tissue out and wipe my eye at one point because I am Gen Y, and Gen X, and when I'm not Gen Y. I know I look 20. I'm Gen X. And when he referred to us as the latchkey child generation, I had to get out a little tissue and wipe away a tear, because when I was a little kid, my mom worked. She had a job. She went to a job every day, and my dad went to a job every day. And when I got out of school, I'd go home, put my key in the door, open it, go inside, shut the door, right? And my best friend's mom was a homemaker. And so when my best friend and I would get in a fight with each other and we'd call each other names like, you're stupid, you're ugly, when it really got mean-spirited, she would say, at least I'm not a latchkey child. So when he said that, it hit home for me, because that is, in fact, my generation. He did a beautiful job of illuminating the generational differences. But to add another layer to that, it's not only a generational gap that we experience, we're also experiencing a cultural generation gap as well. And here's what we know from the census. Our senior populations today are mostly white, and our children are mostly minority. So connect the dots. Most of our senior population is white, most of our children are minorities. 10 states, which are led by Arizona, now have that gap. So they're already experiencing that gap. They're not waiting for the next census to tell them anything they don't already know. They're already experiencing that gap in their state. The other thing that we're beginning to see is that the number of people who identify themselves in the census as multiracial has grown as well. So we're now having a generation of kids who are multiracial. They don't necessarily identify with one predominant race. So the number of Americans in the country who identify themselves as multiracial today are 8.7 million. And a number of people estimate that that number is higher. So that's a low estimate based on what the census told us. If you want to look at it from a percentage standpoint, that's about 3% of the population, and it's a 25% increase from the last decade. So we're experiencing this growing cultural generation gap because we're seeing the numbers of children compared to the numbers of older Americans. There is a huge discrepancy just in terms of race. Now, to get even more, I think, micro about it, let's look at those people who identify themselves on the census as being Latino. Let's use them as an example. Just for the sake of comparison, look at the population of Mexico, which is 108.7 million people, as compared to the population of the United States, which is 50.5. So nearly half, right? There's about a half difference there. 1 in 6 U.S. residents identify themselves as Latino. Now, to drive the point further, let me show you the population of some other historically countries that are Latino. So within the United States today, We have more people who self-identify as Latino than in these countries that historically have always been Latino. So the numbers are in many ways staggering, and they're interesting, and they provide a number of, I think, really important implications for how we do business. Once again, go back to children, and 1 in 4 children in the United States is Latino. And let me blow your mind with this one. This one is the one that always gets me. Every 30 seconds, a Latino turns 18 in the United States. Every 30 seconds, a Latino turns 18 in the United States. So from a hiring perspective, from a talent perspective, from a recruiting perspective, that impacts who is going to be working in our organizations over the next couple of generations. Okay, so for those of you who are like Preston's mom and you can read maps, I'll give you a visual reference point for what we're talking about. So the Latino growth from 2000 to 2010, I don't want you to try to pay attention to all of this. I just want to point out one thing that's interesting. If you look at the legend, look on the map at the areas that are dark blue. Just look at the areas that are dark blue. Those areas in the United States experienced a 100% increase in their Latino population from 2000 to 2010. And they are in some unexpected places. So up along the Canadian border, you see that many of those states doubled their populations of Latinos in their state. Now, granted, that may mean they went from 1 to 2, right? But it's changing. And so this is no longer a phenomenon that's happening along our southern states. And I blew it up there a little for you, especially for those of you in the back. So these are the places where we're experiencing a doubling in the population. So now, let's look at how people are moving about and within the country today. One of the things that the census told us is that we are experiencing a shift in terms of where people live. It's a rural to urban shift. People are moving out of rural areas and into urban counties. In fact, today, 3 out of 4 people live in what is considered an urban county. That does not necessarily mean that you live in the city center or you live in an urban neighborhood. It means that you are within a distance of a city center. So urban counties can include suburban areas. Make sense? So today, 3 out of 4 people live in urban counties. In 2000, 17.3% lived in rural counties, and there was a drop. And while it wasn't a significant drop, in a moment you'll see that it's an interesting drop. I'll sort of play out for you how that's all happening. And then the rural Midwest is where they experience the greatest losses in terms of rural communities. How many of you live in a rural community? Okay, where do you live? Alabama. What town? Lynette, population of?
12,000.
Salute, right? 12,000 people. What is the greatest challenge that you experience in your community are you a business owner? Mm-hmm. Okay, so as a business owner living in a rural population, 12,000 people, what are some of the challenges that you're experiencing? I know, I put you on the spot there.
Yeah. Well, one thing, we were one of those areas that are designated where we've had double the Hispanic population.
Okay.
And I get more and more walk-in customers that I can't communicate with.
Okay, so you're experiencing the challenge of being able to even communicate with your customer because your customer is changing, the demographic is changing. Anything else?
Well, there are a lot of things.
How many other rural people could add to that list and tell me some of your challenges that you're facing? Yes. Okay, finding qualified employees. It's hard to do. And in a moment, I'll probably answer for you some of the reason why that it's hard to do, but it's difficult. Where do you live?
Lebanon, Missouri.
Okay. 12,000 people. So it's hard to find qualified employees. I live, if you're familiar with Texas, I live in the Dallas area just before you get to Denton, Texas. And if you're familiar with that area of North Texas, one of our largest employees in Denton County is Peterbilt Motors. Familiar with Peterbilt Motors? And they have not been as hard hit by the economic downturn as many other organizations have. And so a year ago, they needed to hire 1,000 people. That's huge. They needed to hire 1,000 people, and they couldn't find 1,000 people that were qualified. And so now, every day, they have a bus that buses in people from Oklahoma to come and work at Peterbilt Motors because we didn't have enough of a qualified workforce to fill the gap. So some of these challenges, those of you who are in rural areas, you're already experiencing some of those things. Now, from a visual perspective, let me show you what's been happening. So the changes in rural white population between 2000 and 2009, all the red on the map is where there was a decrease in numbers of people who were white. So your white population in rural areas, this is how much of a decrease was experienced. So as white populations are leaving, here's what was happening at the same time. Between 2000 and 2009, the change in the rural black population was actually increasing. So you see on the map in green that the numbers of black population was going up in rural areas, as was the number of Latinos. So we're experiencing, it's almost like a shift, because if you're my age, I remember studying in college in sociology this phenomenon that was happening in the 60s where white populations were leaving urban areas and they were flooding the suburbs. So they were all getting out of the cities. And now we're actually experiencing the opposite effect. And what we see happening is really being born out of your millennials and your Generation X. And what we're experiencing is something that is called bright flight. That's the phenomenon. People like to name things, and that's catchy, we can remember it. So what is bright flight? Bright flight is a phenomenon that the census found of a number of people 30 years and under who are moving to urban areas. So they're moving into city centers. I was in Chicago about a month ago speaking at an event there, and I was staying in downtown Chicago, and while I was out and about, walking up and down Michigan Avenue, I was struck by how young that city is right now. It's hip and it's cool, and you've got all these young kids out of college, and they're still having fun, and they don't have kids and mortgages, and right? So they're living in the city. They're living in the city because, why? What do you think is attracting them? Work. More jobs to be had. What else? Social, cultural, entertainment, access, right, to culture and entertainment. So where I live, for example, in Dallas, the Dallas area, there is a neighborhood in Dallas that historically has really over time just continued to go downward. And it's a neighborhood called Oak Cliff. And it's a neighborhood that's had a tough time of it. Their populations in terms of poverty and education and access to resources has been a challenge with each passing decade. But over the last 5 years, something very interesting has happened. They have, go back. A number of young developers have actually moved into that community and started what is now referred to as the Bishop Arts District. And this is like hipster haven. Do you live in the area? Yeah, this is like hipster haven. So this is where all the cool 20-something-year-olds are moving into. They're building housing, apartments, condominiums, restaurants, entertainment, bars, pubs, all the kind of cool stuff that generation of kids are looking for. And while it's amazing because it's great economic development, it can also be challenging, especially to those of you who are in rural areas, asking yourself the question of how do we compete? Because we don't have those things to offer. And we'll come back to that and look at some ways you can do that. So some other things that we see happening is that minorities are moving into the suburbs. In fact, the census reveals to us that in 2010, there are more minorities living outside of the city than inside the city. So there are more minorities living outside the city than inside the city. And that's the first time that we've seen that happen just in terms of pure data and numbers. Why might that be the case? Why do you think that's happening? Yes. Quality of life. How so?
Well, education,
Okay.
crime.
Better schools, probably. Lower crime. Why else? What do you think is the number one factor that's driving that phenomenon? Housing, right? Yeah, the availability and the cost. Access to housing when you live in an urban area or a city center can be incredibly expensive. And so this phenomenon is primarily being driven by housing, and it's also been being driven by quality of life issues. So how many of you then are operating your businesses in suburban neighborhoods? How many of you are in suburban neighborhoods? Just a few? Yes? Okay. So many of you are operating, you don't raise your hand for me? I know, the census isn't quite so sexy, right? So for those of us who are operating in suburban neighborhoods, we're beginning to see and feel some of these shifts that are happening. Okay, so we're going to keep moving forward, and then I'm going to talk to you about so what? Why does it matter? Who cares? One thing we know from the census is that people are delaying marriage more than ever before. In fact, people ages 25 to 34 saw their numbers drop in terms of married from 55% in 2000 to 45% in 2010. If you compare that to the 1960s, 80% of people in that age group were married. My husband's mama is 87 years old, and she's a hoot. And she's always saying things that make my kids laugh and make us laugh. And one of the things that she says all the time is, if you're 21 years old and you're not married, you're an old maid, and nobody will want you or have you. Because her generation, you turned 20, you got married, you bought the house, right? You established your life. But more and more people are delaying marriage for a number of different reasons. Another thing that we're seeing with regard to marriage is that 1 in 7 marriages is to a spouse of a different race or ethnicity. The former teacher in me, I can't help myself. I want to give you a homework assignment. This is just a look, listen, and learn assignment. I want you, as you are watching advertising, as you're watching commercials, and you're flipping through magazines, I want you to start to see this playing out in advertising. You see it already? Yes, it is already happening in a number of advertisements today. Very often the couple is of sort of an ambiguous racial background. And sometimes it's even more apparent, right? You'll have maybe an Asian and an African American, or a Latino and a white, with regard to family composition in marriage. So advertisers are already aware of this. They've done their homework, especially those large brands that have like $1-billion advertising budgets. They have their finger on the pulse of it, and they already know it, and so they're already addressing it in the way that they message and storytell to their audience. So the iconic American family that we have celebrated for generation after generation really only accounts for 22% of our households right here and right now. So that very traditional mom and dad, 2 kids, a dog, a white picket fence, and a Suburban, that really isn't who we are right now. It only makes up 22% of our population in terms of homes. So knowing that from a business opportunity and from a messaging and a storytelling opportunity, I think it begs the question, are we showing our customer and our client who they are in terms of the way we talk about us? So do you feel like an expert now? You feel like an expert on the census? Are you good? I want to talk about some of the implications that it has for you as a business, as an organization. For those of you who are business owners and decision makers, I want to tell you how this impacts the way that you do business. We're going to look at a few. I'm going to move through a few a little more quickly than the others because I think that they've been addressed, and so we're not going to spend as much time. The first thing is regard to the buying power of women and what that means for you as an organization. 85% of all brand purchases are made by women. That's kind of staggering, if you ask me. 85% of all brand purchases are made by women. So when I was invited to come and speak at this conference, I went and found the Facebook page for the APRO, and I liked it. And so you guys are coming into my news feed. I use Facebook really more for an educational tool than I do for a talking to my friends and family tool. And someone posted, how many of you have liked the APRO page for Facebook? Okay, so some of you already saw, they posted an article a couple of days ago that said, women hate what? What do they hate? Yes, men. And that's the end of my presentation. So, yes, women hate men. That's the next slide, which is so weird. Women hate. This is good for you to know. You need to know this. Women hate Best Buy. Go back, find the article, read it. It's a good article. Women hate Best Buy. So a research organization, an outside research organization, did a research project on women and consumer behavior and decision making and this, that, and the other, and they focused on women in Best Buy, and what they found is that women hate Best Buy. Why? Why do they hate Best Buy? It's impersonal. How is it, but you say it's targeted to men, but that's sort of abstract. Let's get like really concrete. How is it targeted to men?
Everything.
Everything, that's good.
The colors.
Okay.
The store setup.
Just the actual feel of a store for you feels very masculine. Yes, ma'am?
They have a lot of features of what the products can do,
Yes.
but not how they work in your life.
Okay, so lots of product features and specifications and whiz bang and this, that, and the other, but they're not actually good at relating to you. You feel overwhelmed by the amount of information. Yes, sir? Few women salespeople. So their sales force does not reflect the 85% of people who are making big brand purchases. Any other reasons you think women hate Best Buy? Yes? Okay, so they alienate, and here I love your example because here's what's so fascinating. I can see where people would question this 85% of women make all major brand purchases, because I know some of you are sitting at your table thinking, no, I do, I make that decision. I make that decision. I'm the one that makes that decision. But I think how a lot of the times that plays out is that you think you're making the decision. You're married, aren't you? Yes, yeah. See, so those of us who are married, we get that, we understand. Just that in and of itself is an amazing marketing opportunity for you to capture the attention of the people who are making the brand purchases. It is women who are making those purchases. And this is an opportunity because when you take that and you compare it to the fact that 3% of advertising agency directors are women, it suggests that there is a huge gap there in terms of how we relate to and talk to women. Second homework assignment, go home and Google or YouTube Swagger Wagon. SWAGGERWAGON, Swagger Wagon. Swagger Wagon. When I became a mom, do you like the Swagger Wagon? You and me, I can tell we're friends. I've seen you shaking your head a couple of times. So when I became a mom and I birthed this beautiful child and I held her in my lap and my husband came over and we were sharing this beautiful moment, I said to him, by the way, I'm not ever driving a minivan. I said, so you need to go ahead and make a note. I am not driving a minivan. And I, like many of my other peers, other women my age who were becoming moms, many of us had that same feeling. We felt as if we had to turn in our cool card if we got a minivan. It hurt us inside. And so I told my husband, I'm not getting a minivan. Well, Toyota knows that. And so what they did was they came up with a very clever, inventive, current, hip, and cool advertising campaign that I suspect many of you have never seen, because it was primarily a viral campaign that took off on YouTube. And it became about 4 or 5 different videos. And this was the original video of your typical everyday mom and dad, 30 years old with the 2 kids, wanting to buy a vehicle for their family. And it is a beautiful example of what we're talking about in terms of how do we message to this 85% who is making these brand decisions and purchases. So when you go back, and that's one of the things about conferences. I was a kid, I was raised going to church camp every summer, and I'd go to church camp, and the whole time I was there, I was like, church camp is awesome. Oh, this is great. And then you get on the bus to go home, and you're like, I'm going to be the best kid ever. I'm going to respect my mom, and I'm going to be nice to my sister, and I'm going to do my homework every day, and I'm going to make my bed. Some of you went to church camp too, right? And so on the bus, you're singing, and and you get home, and you're yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir, and you're being nice to your sister, and then about 48 hours later, it's still kind of, yeah. And then by a week later, you're like, I went to church camp. That's what many of these experiences can be like. They can happen in a vacuum. And so the challenge to you is knowing what I know, what do I do with it? And so this is a nice post follow-up for you to go back and watch the Swagger Wagon, and it'll sort of rekindle your enthusiasm and your excitement for putting in some new best practices for your organization, the Swagger Wagon. The other thing that I suspect some of you already know, but it's worth reiterating, is that women make decisions and purchases based on the testimony of other women. So when we need a pediatrician, a new hairstylist, an oil change, we ask our female friends where they go. So from a messaging standpoint, one thing that you can do is begin to capture the testimony of your happy female customers and use them in your social media marketing and advertising, your print advertising, your mailers, etc. Allow those customers to talk about what a wonderful experience they've had, because other women turn to other women when it comes time to make a decision. And it's even more important today than it was 10 years ago, because it's happening faster, because we can go onto Facebook. And I guarantee you it happens several times a week just with my Facebook friends, where someone will come on and say, who's your dog groomer? Who do you go to get your dog groomed? My kid, it happened this morning. So a friend goes online this morning and says, my daughter wants to take a hip hop class when school starts. Can anybody suggest a good dance studio? And within an hour, she had 10 responses of 10 different dance studios to choose from. This is powerful. This is how women are making decisions, is by turning to other women. I think you learned some great takeaways this morning with regard to how to attract millennials, how to sell to millennials, and how to bring them into your team. I want to talk about boomers as well, and the power that they have as a customer base for your businesses. So boomers are, in just terms of numbers, there are so many, but when we actually look at their consumer behaviors, here's a couple of things that we know. It is very difficult to label and box in what it means to be a boomer. And when they report their own decision making in terms of purchases, they don't want to feel like they're being compartmentalized. This is a generation that came of age in a very distinct time and place where individuality started to become a value, and the idea of you can't tell me who I am. And they continue to operate from that perspective in terms of their decision making. They also don't want to be given messages that tap into fear and anxiety about aging. Many boomers, in fact, see themselves as ageless. And so knowing that, that can help you in terms of how you message to them. And then they see themselves as highly unique. And that's sort of interesting. But here's where I find it gets more interesting. How many of you are dedicated Apple consumers? Mac, iPhone, iPad. Have you ever been into a Mac store on any day of the week? Have you ever actually been into a Apple store? What's that experience like? It's like what? Music, crowded. What else? When you go into an Apple store, what's that experience that you're having? How many of you have actually stopped and looked around at who's in there? Homework number 3, go into an Apple store. If you go into an Apple store, I suspect you're probably going to be really highly surprised by the number of baby boomers who are in there buying computers, laptops, iPhones, and it's not for their grandson who's graduating from college next week. It's for them. And not only are they going in and buying those products, they're coming back and they're doing workshops. They're doing one-on-ones. They're asking questions. They're making movies. They're doing all kinds of things because they have learned that they're going to have to adapt to what's happening in our culture right here and right now. And so some interesting things we know about them. 45% of them have downloaded more than 10 apps in the last year. 33% have read a QR code on their smartphone. 35% have downloaded a movie from Netflix or another streaming provider, and 46% buy music by downloading it from a site like iTunes. My mother-in-law is a boomer, and when my husband taught her how to download music on her phone through iTunes, we had to step in and do a music intervention. It was like, you're retired, you're on a fixed income. You can't, but for her it was just this amazing experience because think of it, that's a generation that grew up with having a record album was a pretty big deal. I mean, that cost money and you saved for it and you went and bought it and you played it on your record player and you took really good care of it. And so now suddenly you have this instantaneous access to all that music that you love. And I mean, she just was like a kid in a candy shop. And so baby boomers are very quickly sort of adjusting to what's happening in our culture right here and right now. This morning when he was talking about his mom being on Facebook, I got a Facebook friend request from my mom about 1.5 years ago. And it took me about 2 weeks to accept it. I thought about it, and then I thought about it some more, and then I thought about it some more. And so then I accepted it, and then I just hid my feed from her. No, I didn't do that. But where I really got freaked out was a few months ago, I had a text message from her. And I texted her back and I said, Mom, this must be how you felt when they landed on the moon. This is how that feels for me right now, and I'm so proud of you. And Godspeed. All right, it was amazing that she sent me. But that is what those generations are doing. They're not just getting left behind. They are adapting and they are embracing the changes that are happening. If you want inspiration for this reality, one that I love to reference is Dove, the ad campaign for Real Beauty. I think this is one of the most phenomenally beautiful advertisements I've seen in the last couple of years. And the thing about boomers that we don't want to take for granted is that they have more leisure time and more disposable income than any other generation. And so those two things coupled together make them a very powerful, powerful segment to reach out to and to embrace. So if you're not thinking about how do we market to boomers, this would be something worth thinking about. Next, changing customer expectations. And we're going to move through a couple of these a little more quickly so that we don't run out of time. I want to tell you about an example of a supermarket chain that decided to move into South Korea. It was called Tesco Supermarkets, and their challenge was to capture the market share over another supermarket chain that owned the market in South Korea. And so they did some market research, and there were two things that came out of that market research that they found as both interesting and as providing a really distinct opportunity for them if they could pull it off in the right way. And the two things that they found was that the majority of South Koreans commute every day using the subway system. And the second thing they found is that they hate going to the grocery store. So they sat around and thought, knowing these two things about our customer base, how can we appeal to them? And what they did was they designed a Subway grocery store. Now, it wasn't three-dimensional products. You don't grab a buggy in the Subway and put your milk and your meat and your this and your that in it. Instead, while you were waiting for your train to come, you take out your phone, you open your app, and using a QR reader, you build your grocery list of what you want. Right? You put your phone over the milk, the eggs, the bread, Pringles, Diet Coke, whatever it is you want. And when you get home that afternoon from work, it's waiting for you on your porch. Right? I know, there are some of you in the audience going, move to my community, Tesco Supermarkets. And it is a phenomenally successful initiative. While they don't own the market yet, after 2 years, they have significantly lessened the gap between them and the other supermarket chains. So it is in fact working, and it is those types of things where you have the opportunity, I think, to take what you know from the census data and come up with some original and clever solutions like what Tesco did. The next thing that you can do is to re-examine your footprint. Knowing how our populations are shifting and moving and changing, I think challenges us to determine, for example, what products we're having in our stores and where our stores are located. Next. I think you may have had someone talk to you about going mobile with one of your earlier sessions, and so I don't want to go into too much depth about this, but one of the things that is incredibly important is that it's not just millennials who are doing research to make purchasing decisions. Did you know that over the last 2 months, for the first time ever, more people accessed Google using a smartphone than a computer? More people accessed Google using a smartphone than a computer. And if your consumer behavior is anything like mine, when I'm out and about and I need to go somewhere, find something, do something, read a review, I get on my phone. I have never been to Memphis before. This is my first time here. When I told my mom I was coming, she was like, well, I hope you make time for Graceland. So we'll see if that works out. But this is my first time here. And anytime I travel, and I travel quite a bit for work, I get my phone out, I open my Yelp application, and I find where to eat. And so last night, I went up the street to a very lovely restaurant, sat down, had a really great, what felt like authentic Memphis experience. They told me it was authentic. And the people on Yelp said, this is an authentic Memphis experience. And that's how I made my decision. That's how I decided where to eat. And a number of people are doing that. In fact, Google tells us that 89% of the people who are using smartphones to find information are making decisions and taking actions based on what they find. So they're not just seeking information, they're making decisions based on what they find. 63% of the people in that study also make a purchase monthly using their mobile phone. So using their mobile phone, they're making purchases. Now, we have a little bit a better understanding, I think, of how to reach out to some very specific markets from a customer-client transactional perspective. I want to talk about it to end things today from a more organizational perspective and look at how do we take what we know about the census and plug it in to the way we operate as an organization. So with regard to talent and retention, one of the things that I think every organization needs to really have a handle on is what the measuring stick is for each generation that is in the workforce today, so that you understand the kinds of things that they are looking for. I have to say that in terms of the clients that I work with, one of the ongoing frustrations across industries are the old-timers complaining about the young kids and the young kids complaining about the old-timers. And the number one place I see it, if I were to get even more granular, the number one thing that I hear from the old-timers is that you need to be in the office 12 or 13 hours a day to show that you care. And the young kids don't have a concept of that. And so the measuring sticks are different, and it causes frustration, it causes challenges, it causes dissension. And so knowing the measuring stick that you're using to recruit talent, I think, is incredibly important for your organizations. Next. Keep clicking here. We spent a lot of time talking about the differences between generations, which is fun. Everybody has stories to tell. I was sitting in the back, and there were a couple of things that were said that I laughed and I enjoyed, and I thought, that is so true. And they are worthy discussions to have. What I think is even more interesting when we dig a little bit deeper is that very often our behaviors are connected to a shared or similar value. It's just the way we play out the value that is different. So for example, generations across the board report that family is one of their top priorities, right? Same value. But the way a baby boomer shows that family is their number one value compared to how a Gen X or Gen Y-er shows that family is their value is often different practices. So for a baby boomer, they show they care and love their family by working really hard. and providing the economic support, providing a roof over the head, right? And so working long hours is their way of saying, I care about my family. For a Gen X or a Gen Y, the way they show they love and care about their family is different. It may be, hey, I don't go in on Saturdays because that's the day my kid plays soccer. So I think just from an organizational perspective and the ongoing conversations that you're having, I think it would be a worthy thing to do just over lunch is to get around and say, what are the shared values that we have intergenerationally? What are some common ground that we have? And how can we use that to our benefit? From a human resources perspective, we are finding that more and more people, and it's not even necessarily just within generations, are looking for organizations that have more progressive views on family and that are reflected in their benefits packages. So that is something worth going back and looking at as well. Are we progressive in terms of what we're offering our workforce from a human resources perspective? And then the last thing that I'll tell you, that I'm just going to let one of you add one more so that we can round out at 10. I like even numbers more. Is that we have not reached the mountaintop when it comes to issues of diversity training. That was oh-so 90s kind of thing, and we don't need to do that anymore. That is an ongoing conversation that you need to have in your stores, in your corporate offices, and within your organization. Diversity training is something that should be an ongoing part of what you do every day. Kelly, my colleague, talks about an experience that she had with a client in Kansas. It was a law firm, and they recognized they had a diversity problem. It was a large firm, and when they looked around at the leadership within the firm, they found that they all were old and white and men. And they said, we got to address this. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but we're looking at who's coming out of law schools, and it's diverse. So we need to address that. So they put in place a diversity program, and what they did was they took these recent college graduates and they partnered them up with a mentor. And part of the program was for the mentor to take the mentee to lunch. So an older gentleman in his 60s was partnered up with a young African-American man that had just come out of law school. They go to lunch, and you go to lunch, you make small talk. Get to know each other, ask some questions. And so as they're trying to build some rapport and get to know each other better, the older gentleman says to the young man, "Where are your people from?" And the kid says, "Kansas." And the older gentleman says, "No, where are your people from?" And he said, the kid in his mind thinks, well, maybe he means like my grandparents. And he says, well, my grandparents are from Kansas. And he said, no, what tribe are you from? And we're talking about like a 25-year-old kid who grew up in very different circumstances, so that isn't even something on his radar. He doesn't think that way because from a generational perspective, it just didn't compute for him. And this happened like a year ago. Okay, so this is an ongoing, and you may think, yeah, 1970s. No, this just happened. Diversity is an ongoing conversation that we all need to be having in an organization. So I'd love if anyone has one good one that you would throw out there and say, this is our number 10. What would be one other thing you would say based on what we know about the census findings that will impact the way you do business when you leave Memphis, Tennessee? Right? How many of you heard something today that you thought, oh, I'm gonna go back and do this? Yes. You're going to eat lunch with the younger generation, but that's mine. Anybody think of something? I'm going to do this that wasn't mentioned. I'm going to, louder? Send his wife to Best Buy. Yeah, I think that's a good one, is really look around at your competition and see if they've heard this presentation. Are they doing these things or not? And is this a golden opportunity for us to start looking at the way we message and storytell and get in front of our team, our future employees, our future customers, and our clients? And really, ultimately, it's about knowing and understanding your audience. And that is an ongoing dialogue that you have to have as an organization, I think, to remain relevant in order to compete in the marketplace. We mentioned Kelly's book, which is an amazing asset to you follow up if you want to go back and use that as a resource, where she talks about very distinct groups of demographics. It's a nice way to complement what we talked about today. It was reviewed and recommended in a number of different places like Forbes and Fast Company. Mine wasn't, but my mom said it was the best book she's ever read. And if you knew my mom, you would know that that was really high praise. In fact, the first time she read it through, she marked it up with a red pen. So knowing that, that's my big review and recommendation. But both of those books really address, from a marketing and advertising perspective, how do you take what you know about the census and how do you plug it in a way that will help you to stay competitive in the marketplace. I will be back this afternoon in a breakout session to talk about branding. So if any of you would like to visit one-on-one, I know you have a speaker coming up after me, but I will stick around after the branding session if you'd like to meet, shake hands, talk, exchange stories. I hope that your time has been well spent this morning and this afternoon, and I look forward to meeting some of you. Enjoy the rest of your week in Memphis.